Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Planning Commission podcast. Today's episode, Big Schools, Bigger Problems, with our guest, Dr. Jeff Vincent. The Planning Commission podcast is a discussion you never even knew you needed. Sit back, join us for a conversation between a couple of old friends and their guests to talk about all the things that are happening in this wide-ranging profession called planning. Our views are our own and don't reflect those of any national planning organizations or any particular public agencies and only belong to us. So read your commission packet, know your Robert's rules, and enjoy this, the Planning Commission podcast. Hey, commissioners, how are we doing today?
We're doing
happy. It's a Friday for those of you at home. You don't know this, but we record at home. Let's start off with a little bit of a roll call. Commissioner Kostelik.
Present, but I'm still recovering from our Rip Van Winkle style sleep, this being episode 2. For the younger generation, well, I'm not going to explain who Rip Van Winkle was. Never mind.
It also is a good whiskey, though, and that's also to be discussed at a later date.
That's a good point.
Commissioner Minshall.
Here, recovering from our planning and zoning meeting last night.
Everybody's recovering because we're old. All right. And I am here, Commissioner Danley. Let's go over our agenda today. Our discussion item, our whiskey pairing, our interview with Dr. Jeff Vincent, and our lightning round commissioners. Can I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Perfect. Thank you very much. All right. To our listeners, just a reminder, you can find all our past meetings at our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Hit up our YouTube station, our Amazon, Apple, Spotify, all those things. Subscribe, like, give us some feedback. You got an idea for a future episode? Absolutely. Let's do it. Man, this episode, I have been waiting like a year for this episode, and
you've been waiting to be on this soapbox in this venue for 3 years, 4 years.
No other subject in planning gets me going like this discussion, especially in our lovely state. For those of you who don't know, in Idaho, where, man, we get this wrong, in my opinion. Probably I think we lead the league in getting it wrong. How about that?
Easily.
Big schools, big campuses, more particularly big campuses in our state. The population numbers aren't as big, that's for darn sure. But okay, I can't pull my own string. I don't want to dominate this episode. So, to my fellow commissioners, what is your biggest pet peeve with American school campuses today? Any thoughts?
I would say the prison style architecture that dominates things. And, we were in Napoleon Dynamite territory this summer in Preston, Idaho. You see that high school on the facade, and you're like, we used to take pride in our public institutions from an architectural perspective, and we've just thrown all that out. And I think the thing about big box schools, it's the same big box design and the same things that just don't reflect who we are.
Yeah, architecture in schools, man. Think about when you see a high school or middle school or whatever that's 100 years old and look at it, it's like, man, well, look what we used to build, right? It was pretty amazing. And now you're kind of going, it's the same handful of companies that do the design, and they tend to look the same. Sabrina, you got anything?
Yeah, I'm glad Dawn went first, because I thought mine was going to be too punchy, but it's not. My biggest pet peeve is that as parents, and I've had 2 high schoolers go through different sizes of schools, that when my son was in a big box high school, you not only have to pay for a parking permit, you have to pay for premium parking permits. And then when they're a senior, they're supposed to pay. And now they make a big deal that they get to decorate their parking permit.
Oh, yeah.
And of which there's never actually enough parking. So they end up parking not on the sites. But there's these huge sea of parking. It never made sense to me of now we're paying another literally over $100 for kids to park their vehicles.
I remember being in Chicago, and there's a public high school, I think, called New Trier, that's just known for its academics. And it was to the point that wealthy parents were buying houses around the high school just as a place for their kids could park.
Oh my God.
I think ours is even better than that. When my son was in high school, he would go occasionally to the nearby church areas meetings just so they would recognize his car. So if he parked in that nearby church parking lot, they wouldn't, tow him or think that he didn't belong there. So they were like, oh yeah, he comes sometimes. So like he was a quasi member of a church on his own to make sure he had a place to park.
Pay your tithing, you park for free.
You actually don't even have to pay. You just have to show up to youth dances every once in a while. So yeah, it was just, it was interesting of how they actually make choices that way.
I guess mine, I mean, it's a litany of things, but I will just stop with just one. And that is, I'm just amazed at how much time and effort and land we think about and use and so forth with regard to, the busing and the parking, frankly. And just like, I mean, you see in our neck of the woods, right? 70 acres for crying out loud. And like, what is it? 15, 20 of it is asphalt, and then these kids go to school and they're taught about climate change, which is great. They should be. But I'm like, wait a minute, school, how are we dealing with this on our own? And like, let's have some consistency in the message. But anyway, that's a lot. There's a whole lot more. I can't wait to have this conversation with Jeff Vincent momentarily. So Dawn, let's go in to our whiskey pairing and change gears a little bit on our episodes, Big Schools, Bigger Problems.
Well, in honor of big box schools, I chose a big box whiskey with Kirkland Canadian whiskey from Costco. This is a 1.75 liter, a handle of that, oak cast aged 6 years. And actually, compared to our big box schools, for a big box whiskey, it's pretty good. It's pretty smooth.
And I know you didn't buy it in this state because you got it at Costco, and our state don't sell it. So anyway, all right. Well, before we get into our interview, just as a reminder to our listeners, head on over to Plan Edison. We would like to take a quick moment and thank our friends at Plan Edison for supporting today's podcast. If you're looking to sharpen your urban planning skills and advance your planning career, head on over to Plan Edison Courses, which offers over 300 courses on cutting-edge planning topics and skills, such as parking reform, missing middle housing, equity analysis, and climate resilience. Visit courses.planedison.com/PC10 to take advantage of an exclusive offer for Planning Commission podcast listeners. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce a real expert on this subject, Dr. Jeff Vincent, who is the Director of Public Infrastructure Initiatives at the Center for Cities and Schools at the University of California, Berkeley. That is a wonderful title.
And the newest member of the Atlantic Coast Conference.
That's right. Jeff, welcome to the Planning Commission podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
Well, we'll see about that.
Yeah, it remains to be seen.
I'm going to have you introduce yourself a little bit in a minute, but man, first of all, to our listeners, I gave Jeff's full title because I highly encourage you to head on over to their website and just kind of thumb through the research that they have done. There's a lot of good stuff on this subject. And man, just document upon document of great things that I think you'll find helpful. I want to read a quick sentence here that encapsulates this issue so very much, and it's so eloquently stated, and it's very, very simply stated here. Where schools are located influences family travel patterns in the short run and spatial community development for decades. Wow. It's simple, right? It's pretty straightforward, man, but it has short-term effects right now and tomorrow and long-term effects for our community. And that's definitely setting the stage for our discussion today. So Jeff, hit us off. Tell us about you, your background, and how the heck did you become interested in this subject of school campus size and design?
Yeah, I can do that. And I'm glad you chose a sentence that was relatively short. I love to write these sentences that have 8 commas in them, because everything's connected to everything when you're a planner, right? So, I mean, I'm a planner by trade. My degrees are all in planning. And when you look at the field of planning, you deal with everything, right? Whether it's parks, whether it's sewers, whether it's roads and traffic, et cetera. And as I was a young, aspiring, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed planner, I just kind of I noticed that, wow, there's something in every community. and there seems to be a wall. Like planners don't touch it, they don't deal with it, it's not taught in any of the classes, and it's public schools. And so I just kind of started looking into that and trying to understand why. I read a lot of like old history articles and books from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s on this issue, and just trying to wrap my head around it. And then seeing that kind of gap in the field, I guess, or that blind spot, which we can talk about. But, I had colleagues here at Berkeley who were, working on similar stuff or interested in similar things about kind of, issues around children's success and how that relates to school. And so anyway, long story short is that colleagues here who were doing education policy and knowing that, these sort of out of school factors, really influence children, like the quality of their communities and whatnot. And so we sort of joined forces and said, let's start a center at a university that's a home for people that want to look at the intersection of these issues around education and education quality and equity and sort of place and planning. And so we formed a Center for Cities and Schools.
So Jeff, you spoke about reading back the books from the 1920s and kind of the history of some of the issues. Tell us more about that history of school design, campus design. And I guess, because we all read too many history books, we are interested in why did it change over time?
I mean, well, what's interesting about like, if part of me asked, why are schools so separate, right? People talk about these sort of silos between like local government, local city government or county government and planners and school districts. And what I uncovered, and, education professor taught me this, was that, school boards were created, I forget if it was the 20s or so, but they were basically created to take like the machine politics out of public education, right? Mm-hmm. And so
that didn't work very well.
It was very noble at the time, but I think we could make the observation that there's a lot of sort of gnarly politics now wrapped up in each locality with school districts and with school boards rather. And so, and you also see like school board membership being sort of stepping stone to higher other political office, let's just say. And so that was a really interesting twist that, it didn't even occur to me at the beginning. So, I think, that's issue, there's that sort of on the sort of organizational side. But I mean, if you guys want to talk about, you asked a question about history. I mean, if you want to go through like sort of the history of design of like how campuses are designed, how buildings are designed, I mean, it's pretty interesting, I think, from a planning perspective, and like how communities have been, are changing at the same time. So
where did we make that? Yeah, where did we make that pivot with school campus design? Where did we pivot from this neighborhood stuff to these big box campuses that are bigger than Disneyland? That can't just be a school board function, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, there will be high schools that are 50 plus acres, right? You have middle schools that are 20, 30, 40 acres.
We would take ones that small in Idaho and be happy with it. That's how
we would. Yeah, we would.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty fascinating. And there's been a couple of books written on this, but like, I mean, sort of making a very long and detailed historical story short, I think, if you go back to like the 1900s, right? Predominantly America had one-room schoolhouses, particularly in rural areas, but even in the cities and stuff. And so, it was like the early 1900s, you start to see a shift, right? Like people are thinking, oh my God, we have to standardize these things. There's more kids. And that's where you start to get more classrooms with rows of desks and periods, the introduction of, first period, second period, third period, and there's a bell. And that happens right in the early 1900s at the same time as industrial revolution, right? We're industrializing cities. And so really the thinking was, okay, if all of these, soon to be adults need to work in factories, they need to sort of be trained to kind of be in a factory environment. And that's sort of where you have this more clock regimented thing. And so, class. And so it's, the thinking was like, these schools would sort of serve as factories to produce learning, not widgets, but learning, right? And so, it was very much clockwork, it's very much efficiency, and there were lots of students. And so that's where you start to see these sort of like larger schools. And often these schools were multiple stories tall, right? Because particularly this was in more like urbanized areas, right? Is where it's happened. And so, but then the next shift you have, which was really driven on the education side, is like, probably like 1930 to 1950, roughly, you have an education of the progressive era. And it was sort of like the backlash against that, right? And so you had like John Dewey, you had Horace Mann, you had Maria Montessori, and they were basically saying like, hey, we need more of a child-centered approach to education. We can't have this sort of factory approach. And so that was where you start to get these open air schools, right? Where you sort of start putting in more windows, more light, things like that. That's when they started doing kind of outdoor learning. And so, but it was still very much lecture style, right? There's an expert in the front of the room who's an adult, and there are children in rows, in those classrooms. And so, that goes on. And then, the real change, I don't know if there's like a pivot, so to speak. It's sort of like an incremental, like, oh, and now we're going down this road where we have all the problems that you guys described. But, then you look at like post-war, right? Post-World War II. If there's a pivot, that's probably it, so I don't know, like 1945 to 1960, roughly. This is where architects started getting into this because, you had a huge boom in children, right? So it was like sort of crisis mode, like, oh my God, we need seats for butts, right? Like there's a lot of children. And so this is where you actually see a pivot to one-story flat roofed schools and glass and metal windows. And part of that is driven by, we just have those materials now, right? After World War II, we had those kinds of windows that are being mass produced in other pieces of schools, and they can be done. But I think, the shift to one-story schools really ties into like the size of campus, right? Because if you're not building up, it's similar with housing, right? If you're not building up, you're building out for the same capacity. And so, but again, it was really like efficiency. You had these like, I don't know, I went to schools in these, and Frank, my office is like this right now. It's like these metal, like I think they call them ribbon windows. They're super tall and wide, and they go all the way up, and then below it is the like heating element below it. And so you see that when you drive around most neighborhoods. But this is where you get these more like sprawling campuses because you have these things. And then after that, you had, the 60s, it started social upheaval. There was desegregation going on, but you also had shrinking enrollments. And so that's when this thing called the open classroom emerged, which was not necessarily all these individual little classrooms, but larger classrooms that were sort of broken up with walls inside that were movable, et cetera, open space classrooms and stuff. And I think, but you also have the emergence of the field of education psychology, which tried to understand how the inside of a classroom relates to teaching and learning. And that was really the first time we started to do that in a non-factory kind of mindset. But I think what's interesting in terms of like the field, it's kind of, you look at like what the APA has done in the planning field or recommended over years, and those kinds of things get ingrained. There was some stuff happening parallel to that in the school facility world, which was kind of flying under the radar probably for planners, but it kind of needs to be in the history books. But like the Ford Foundation funded this like huge laboratory of architects to sort of lay standards for this stuff. And those things got like stamped around and just picked up. And part of that was really large site sizes, right? And so
okay, hold on a second. So you're gonna tell
I know
me
I'm going on.
No,
right?
you're no.
I want to
You're
talk about sites.
Lecturing.
You're doing great, and I know Sabrina. I want you to keep going. Sabrina's gonna have I know she has a follow-up question in a minute, but I just want to make sure I need to know my history as a history major, for crying out loud. So that's something new that I did not know, which is obviously we all are well versed on Henry Ford and automation that occurred in the assembly line and what the automobile has done to our communities. We know that. But I didn't know this other detail. So now you're telling me that the same company that brought that also then doubled down in this sort of niche, what we thought was a niche world of education and campus sizes by industrializing. Oh man, see, you're blowing my mind. Go ahead, keep going. This is awesome.
That's taking the machine politics out of it, by the way, right?
That's great.
Actually, you just blew my mind that I just found out you were a history major. Like
oh yeah.
What I thought I knew has just gone out the window.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I was an anthropology major early on, but then I decided that urban planning was slightly more lucrative than anthropology, which is why I pivoted, right? And for the record, it was the Ford Foundation, which of course was the philanthropic arm.
Right.
It's still
Okay.
in existence today. But anyway,
Uh-huh.
so here's where you really start to like do mechanical HVAC and all this stuff, and sort of schools get tighter, right? They're less open, less fresh air and stuff. And so actually on the institutional side, this is when the Council of Education Facility Planners International forms in the early 70s.
But
And
what's the acronym for that?
CEFPI.
Okay.
Right. Are you okay? Yeah, maybe you're familiar. But anyway, they have sort of been labeled the culprit on these large site standards a number of years ago, because they published a guide for planners and it had very large site recommendations for elementary, middle, and high school. And so when you trace it, that's where a lot of states, when they started putting these policies in place, like in the 90s or so, probably, they were just grabbing them from the experts, right? And so without, a whole lot of context on that. So I don't know. I mean, so then fast forward, keep going. I mean, if you look at, now you got all kinds of things going on and we can talk about that. But if you look at like the 1980s, this is when enrollments declined again. And so you didn't have this sort of crisis moment of having to rapidly build schools, although we did build a lot of schools in the 90s in particular. But one thing that happened interesting, which is really where a lot of my work is, that people started to go, oh, we have a lot of K-12 schools around the country now, and a lot of them are really old now, and a lot of them are actually not in very good condition. Of course, you have neighborhoods changing around them. You have white flight and all those things going on, which is happening, of course. But the U.S. GAO, the Government Accountability Office, they come out with a big report that Congress asked for in 1995, I think it was, basically the condition of America's schools. And they're not looking at size, but they're looking at the physical condition. How's it really teaching and learning? And basically what they say is like, there's a lot of schools falling apart. And so anyway, but keep going is like, 90s, there's a big look at green building and LEED certification comes on. And what are we doing now? I think we're doing everything in it, all kinds of stuff now, because what's happening inside schools, all kinds of new stuff, right? You've got, group learning, you've got maker spaces, you've got career technical education. You're trying now, a lot of states are bringing in early ed. So there's really a lot of rethinking going on.
So my follow-up question is really about pivoting from both what happens inside, but I guess it's related. School my son went to was basically like a mini college campus. And it's bigger than some college campuses, but especially in the Northwest area, and I'm sure there's other parts of the country, kind of first of, how do you see the regionality effect? And part of what I mean by that is the cost of land, and whether that's sprawl or maybe a school district who's kind of focused on the short-term ROI, right? Like, we're going to buy cheap and it's going to save us money, not thinking about all the downstream costs. How do you see that either being different in different regions, or how is that in your research affecting where schools even get cited to begin with?
Yeah, one of the things, people started talking about 15 years ago in kind of the smart growth movement was these sprawl schools, right? And they were basically saying that school districts were purchasing land often on the outskirts of growing suburbs of town, leapfrogging out and buying that land because it was cheaper or whatever, it was large enough, and then building a school there, and then all the infrastructure gets built out to it, right? And then, developers are like, great, now I can tap into that and build these suburban neighborhoods. And that probably is still happening in some areas. Although there is a debate about, did the school district respond to development that was already approved in those areas, or did they actually leapfrog out there? And I think what you find in reality is like both happened. But from a like a land purchase perspective, I think what's interesting is you've got public school districts. There's like 10,000 of them across the country, right? And they're competing in the private market for land, which is only increasing in value. So the cards are kind of stacked against them. Local governments, for the most part, in most states and most localities, are not really helping the school districts find land to accommodate new development. Sometimes you'll have developers that step in, they do planned unit developments, or they actually give or sell very cheaply land next to one of their new developments. As an aside, they often give the district the land that's the hardest to develop, et cetera. That's a separate story. So, sometimes, so what you did see is like some of this leapfrog stuff going on. I think there was sort of a backlash of that from, the smart growth movement during the 1990s about that, because, you saw some of the stats on walking and biking to school is really amazing. Like in the late 60s, it was like, I was looking at my numbers here, 85 to 87% of kids are walking and biking to school. By 2010 or so, that's dropped to about 20%. And that's not just the school's fault. It's like us planners and developers, we're not necessarily building walkable, bikeable communities in those times.
We had an example here in the Boise region. I think it was when all three of us commissioners were working for the same agency. Brand new middle school opened. It was loosely developed around it, but all of a sudden the parents are coming unglued going, how do we get to our kids to this middle school? And the highway agency we were with at the time, and we had a school district in the city, we kind of figured, I want to say it was around $100,000 to at least create a crude sidewalk or pathway connection to the school. And we as the highway agency said, well, we can facilitate this. We'll figure out the right of way. But city, you approved the land use. School, you chose the site. You need to pay into this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And both of those other agencies said, no, we're not going to do that. And that was my first experience of going, this is a policy failure.
Yeah, exactly.
This is a policy failure that has other, as Sabrina said, downstream effects. So what are you finding with some of those other downstream effects, not really related to maybe transportation or government infrastructure? We're talking like physical health, mental health, teacher absenteeism. What are those things ancillary to this that are having an effect on our students and our teachers?
Well, that's a big question, but I think you've nailed it. It's a policy question. And what you find is actually looking at different state policies, there's kind of like a gap in state policy, and it enables, sort of one set of governments to be like, we're not doing that. Right. So, one thing I've noticed is like in Florida, they have adequate public facility finance, what is it? APF.
Yeah.
That's one example. There's other sort of models of those in the States, and I don't actually know how well they're doing. I would be really curious to see, with regard to schools. But I think there's more acknowledgement now that local governments need to work together, at least in some regard, on these things, or they do it. I don't know. I get random calls all the time from local government, school district folks that are just like at an impasse on this, and we're talking about a lot of money for infrastructure. So some of that has cooled down in the sense that, at least in California here, like we're not doing a whole lot of like rapid expansion in, the sort of suburbs and outer. So some of that dynamic
is because you sent it all up to the Northwest.
That's right. Yeah. You're welcome.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
It's helpful. It's freeing up space in our schools, all that.
Yeah. Except, I work for what used to be a rural county. Yeah, that's great, but I hope we all can eat in a few years, because we're certainly consuming land.
We've got school campuses, you can see the curvature of the earth from the edge of them. That's how big and in the middle of nowhere that they are.
But
that's good for the science lessons.
But those schools they spell the word view, VUE. So it's really, sophisticated in that way.
And literally you're walking uphill both ways to school.
Yeah. Well, that's what they did in Little House on the Prairie. Was that wrong? Goodness.
It feels like, Jeff, you need to come take a tour of our our circular world.
Yeah. So, Jeff, I'm going to hit into a different area, and that's equity. As I mentioned before we get started on the recording, I was just in California, in a city that, now I'm going to tell you how we're doubling down on this issue. Not only are we building big campuses that in some cases are not in the neighborhood, they might be on the fringe. Now, controversial topic, open enrollment. I was in a district in a city of about 60,000 people where open enrollment is all over the place. This city has 9 school districts, 9, because there are, I think, 5 or 6 schools that are also their own district. And the biggest of the districts has an open enrollment policy. So the concept of even it being your neighborhood school in this case is now gone. And that choice on the transportation front is just blowing the model up completely. And, from the education side, I can sort of understand it, but it definitely gets into some research that you all have been doing with respect to schools and equity and again, all of the ramifications and planning. So I wonder if you can kind of touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, for the planners out there, I mean, if you look at the writing in the 30s and stuff around the neighborhood unit, it's like Clarence Perry and others, right? It was always around an elementary school physically. It's very clean, very orderly, right? I mean, but now you've got changing neighborhoods, but now you have everyone doesn't go to their local school, right? There's school choice, there's charters, there's private schools, there's other things. So that's a shift that has sort of made a disconnect, large, not for everyone, of course, but where you live and where you go to school. And that's really complicated from an equity perspective, from a DSEG perspective, from a transportation perspective, right? But we've been doing a ton on equity. I mean, the thing that I've really been getting into is like looking around and seeing just the difference in the conditions and qualities of buildings and campuses on public schools across the state, our state of California, but also across the country, right? And you see largely that in lower wealth communities, you have older, often buildings and campuses with a lot of deferred maintenance, but they also tend to be very bare bones, right? They don't have these extra spaces, sophisticated labs or theaters or, redone outdoor spaces. They're sort of classrooms and offices. And so, this issue of like, what is a school, right? What's a complete school? And what we found is like, we've followed the money on that, is to look at how school facilities and the land are financed, right? And what you see is that local school districts raise dollars to do those things, usually through like general obligation bond or some other taxing measure, depending on what the state is. Sometimes they get developer fees, again, depending on state policy. And then most states, though not all, kind of contribute to that. And we've done a lot of research on this that has shown, unfortunately, but not surprisingly, that the ability to raise those dollars from one school district to the next is really inequitable. School districts in higher wealth communities, particularly property wealth, are much more able to raise local tax dollars and tap state monies. And their schools tend to be in better condition, have like more of these kind of programmatic things and spaces in them that enhance the program, et cetera, right, than lower wealth communities. And we and a number of colleagues around the country have looked at this through many different angles and in many different states. And the pattern is really persistent. And that's why we've been kind of advocating for some federal funding to help upgrade schools, particularly in low wealth communities. But it's really like upgrading these older schools and the schools that are really sort of in poor condition in these existing neighborhoods, And so now there's a lot of interest in, obviously health, indoor air quality and stuff, but also from a climate resiliency and a climate justice perspective. Can these schools kind of mitigate these new pressures around extreme heat, super dry, super wet, where we didn't have those patterns before, right? They were built for a different kind of climate. So these are the kinds of things like we're starting to get into from a policy perspective.
I think about it. I went to an elementary school in the South. It was in Western North Carolina, rural area, but we didn't even have air conditioning.
Yeah.
And certainly could feel those things toward the shoulder season or the end and beginning and end of school year. Sabrina?
Yeah, but if you were in the South, I mean, were you wearing shoes to school? I mean, did you really need that?
Wow. Well, he was a big Dukes of Hazzard fan.
It was the mud.
Know,
the mud we had to walk through that kept us cool through the day.
I was just saying, that there was their trade-off. I mean, I was interested in when Commissioner Danley was talking about the equity of these different school policies, and you spoke about kind of the physical equity. But I remember we were living in the Spokane area when my daughter was starting high school. And when we moved there, just contrasting where we had lived and where to the state of Washington, it really did have us almost like school choice, where we were literally able to shop schools and decide kind of, it segregated people. Like what kind of school does this have? And there's room because the money would go with the kid. So it wasn't like we had all grown up where it's like you were picking where you lived based upon the quality of the school or, how close it was. It didn't matter. I mean, now we had to be willing, and we did. We drove her 25 minutes to high school until she got her license, because we wanted a school that was 800 kids and smaller. And the schools around us were low income. They were old. They didn't have good programs of what she wanted to do. So I'm just reflective of that I thought it was going to be so much different and better going to a different state, but it was just very different problems. So I'm just curious if maybe a summary question of, who's doing it well and who's not. I mean, we have our own experiences.
Yeah, people are always asking me that. I think I don't know exactly who's doing it well. I mean, I think that this is a good question for some of the listeners. I would love to hear where it is happening well. Because every community is kind of dealing with a different set of issues. And I think that, but what most communities now are dealing with is not necessarily expansion, because enrollments are kind of declining in a lot of places, at least, again, I'm speaking for California, but they're really trying to figure out what's our strategy for reinvesting in some of these neighborhoods. So there's that. I don't know. In terms of local planning, I know I need a better answer for this, but I struggle to find it because people always want to talk about the problems. And there's not, I mean, part of the reason we started a center, we're an applied policy center, our aim is not to write academic, scholarly, genius papers. It's really to provide some guidance and insight to people making decisions every day, whether they're commissioners or planning staff or school district planners, and I think this field, if you want to call it that, or this sort of in the middle of this Venn diagram of some fields, the guidance and the understanding of it is really, it's a big problem. We're trying to build the field, essentially, is what we've been trying to do.
Well, we were in Issaquah, Washington a few years ago. We were in, Chris can probably share the story from Bend, Oregon, and we're used to they're competing in the private market for land, right? That was clearly driving the school district in Issaquah's approach because they could have gone to the fringe, but land in the Puget Sound is expensive. They built a 3-story brand new elementary school in a central part of town. They use the excess paved areas for courts and things to connect to the parking lot. So the 5 or 6 events a year that needed extra parking, they could park there. And they were even to the point, because of the wet climate, of building compacted sand playgrounds that were more durable. And then when we talked to them about a campus that had both a middle school and a high school, and I want to say a combined 4,000 students, they said, oh man, when we found we could get 50 acres, we thought we can do a high school and a middle school. And that's so foreign to what we have here. And I know Chris has a Bend, Oregon, story as well. So those are the places we found, maybe by necessity of land values, are doing it well rather than from some prescribed or purposeful policy.
Well, what's interesting on that is thinking, this is for another episode, but look at the land owned by public school districts in community across community. If you've got declining enrollments, they have a lot of land. There's some land banking, you might even say. So if we have a new normal of much lower enrollments, are there other opportunities for affordable housing and other things on those properties? I mean, I think that's what's super interesting.
Yeah. Well, and then in fast growing areas, like in our area, even from a local government perspective, we find out that a school has purchased land, not even worrying about the zoning or the location, because that entitlement's coming later. And so they've already made this investment. So they essentially get some of the local governments a bit over the barrel, because they're like, well, we've already done it. We've already used the tax dollars, or they're just not thinking through that process. So that's just part of the solutions is maybe some of these is case studies, like what didn't work.
Yeah.
I think most school districts can override local zoning, but
right.
Well, but they know it. They know it.
Yeah. Well, gosh, then, and this subject, we had one here where we needed all this land. It was a huge high school. It was so poorly decided that they reached their capacity in the second year, and it was only 1,800 kids at a high school, which for many urban areas is not that big, right? And I will say this, to your point, just in the same community I was in where open enrollment was happening, talking with the superintendent, and he was saying, hey man, we have a housing affordability issue, and we are now going to look at carving off, I think it was like 17 acres of land that they were going to have to a land trust that was then going to eventually, through the participation with a developer, put in housing that was specifically going to go toward, hopefully, a lot of the teachers and staff. man, I mean, that's a noble idea. And I think we can do a lot more of that as opposed to some of the other things that we've
And
been
even
seeing.
if like they can preempt local zoning, well, okay, if you've got this big box school, it's on the fringe, you're going to have leapfrog development. At least from the planning side, we can plan for the densities and uses close to that school so we get some efficiencies in the future rather than just, oh, poor us and surrounding it by the same thing. So I think that's even something in light of maybe we can't control a school decision specifically. We can be better as planners in orienting the land use and the housing piece. Like you said, Chris, that's a magnificent example.
And it's also their playgrounds, right? I mean, in the summertime, we sit there to watch sprinklers, and who's using it? Come on, we can maximize this as an investment, but we just simply don't, and it's so frustrating. Serena, one last point, and we're gonna turn into the lightning round.
Yeah, it was more just, it's back to something you said, Jeff, in the beginning. It's a bit of a chicken and egg, especially with both design and land use. It, just thinking about, are the schools then, even if they preempt zoning, are they now attracting that people want to be closest to the schools, right? And so then you create that again. So it's a curious cycle that, I'm not sure which is causing which, but it's definitely causing implications.
And even though they look like prisons, they don't want to be near prisons. So why do they want to be near schools? So that'll be my tie back to my original.
Right, there you go.
Well, there are people that do demographic projections for school districts. That their consultants, they have whole firms that do this. And what I hear from them is that it ain't science, it's art. Because it's really hard to predict anymore.
And it's definitely like kindergarten art. So
yeah. All right. Well, I knew that this topic would be a good one, and I sometimes I say this and I mean it, but man, we could probably have 3 or 4 episodes on this topic and just keep going. To me, it truly is such a profound issue that we just don't talk about. And Jeff, to your credit, to your team's credit, you're doing everything that you can to change that. And to our listeners, go over citiesandschools.berkeley.edu. Check out Jeff and his team's work, and so much good stuff. Pay attention to this. Think about it in your own community, right? And what is your own zoning code and your own school districts? What are they doing? And I think to Sabrina's point, ask the question, how much land do they own and where is it? Because guess what? That's your future, right? And if we don't want it over there, well, we better start talking about it yesterday, frankly. So, Jeff, we're going to turn it to the lightning round for a few minutes, and then we'll wrap up this episode. One of your other titles, man, you're an acclaimed human being, no doubt about that, right? You are also a planning and zoning commissioner at the city of Berkeley. So I got to ask you in our first lightning round question, what's your biggest pet peeve variance?
Oh God. Well, to be honest, we've sort of removed all things. Like you can do so much by right here. Wow, that is maybe rear setback. It might be rear setback.
That's pretty specific. All right, I like it. All right.
I want to go next because I'm still recovering from our P&Z meeting last night, so I have another P&Z one. All right, Jeff, what's the worst or craziest behavior you've ever seen at a P&Z meeting? And it can be a commissioner or the public.
Oh, people love to talk about the fact that their zucchini will not grow because it will be shaded by heights and density. And people have brought zucchinis in particular to these meetings, and it's become a thing now.
I mean, come on, it's not going to grow to the fair award-winning size zucchini. It'll actually be digestible at the size it is. That's probably a good thing. My goodness.
This type of year, I want it to be pumpkins. I could use some more pumpkins on my porch.
So given it's Berkeley, how many P&Z meetings have been held in trees that you were trying to save?
Only a few. I mean, we're normally hugging, during the meetings. But
yeah. Better school-based movie. Back to School, with Mr. Rodney Dangerfield, Tripper Lindy, all of that.
Again, or when you have no class.
Or The Breakfast Club.
Oh God.
I know.
I'll go with The Breakfast Club, actually. I'm a Gen Xer.
When you watch The Breakfast Club, do you look at the campus and go, they would never have done it like that, right? Is it a hard time to watch things like that?
It is. You remember that movie Election with
yeah.
That was actually filmed in my high school. And a lot of the scenes take place where we would hang out. So that was kind of interesting. That was cool.
All right. So when you were going to school, and you can pick elementary, middle school, or high school? How did you get to school?
Embarrassingly, I think I lived 5 blocks in high school, maybe 4. I drove every day. Are you kidding me?
You're a red-blooded American, man, right?
Did you pay for parking? That's what I want to know. Did you have to pay for the
Oh,
parking?
good Lord, no.
Oh,
Good Lord,
man.
no. Gas was also 96 cents.
Yeah, we had to pay for our senior parking. You had to pay up for that. I don't think they would have liked what I would spray paint in my parking space with back then.
I think we would all agree unanimously that we would say that is true.
Favorite
Yeah, I would
school
agree.
lunch, stop sign pizza or regular pizza?
Oh, stop sign, definitely.
Oh, yes.
All right. How about your last concert or your next concert? Who are you seeing? What'd you see?
I'm actually going to the San Francisco Jazz Center tonight.
Ah,
This morning I spent listening to the reissue of the Replacements Tim album, which got remixed. In Replacements lore, it was mixed very terribly and flat. But they just released it this morning. Their album Tim, it's amazing. It sounds 3D. It's quite remarkable. But tonight I'm going to see this jazz drummer called Mark Giuliani. I think is how you say his name. He's amazing.
Awesome.
I've become more sophisticated from like Replacements,
I see that.
punk trash to.
All right. So I'm going to ask a question that all of us are guilty of. So I'm curious. When you travel for fun, do you go and take pictures of schools?
I try to, and it's actually every time I'm traveling, like I'm going to Central Valley for soccer tournament this weekend for my son. And like, I try to, but my family doesn't like it. And we usually don't leave enough time, but I have this dream of getting a big grant to just drive around like Fear and Loathing style, the country, just to take photos of school campuses.
Well, and I think
So
if you're doing it officially, you're not going to look as much like a creeper as if you're just randomly taking pictures of schools.
It's
right?
tricky to take pictures of schools when there are children on campus.
I'm kind of visioning this like big RV where like you're driving down and you're jumping out and taking pictures. Like this is probably something that's been, Commissioner Danley's dream for a while. He could still drive
an RV. It's a school. It's the Partridge Family bus.
Yeah. Now you're Breaking Bad style. You gotta be careful.
Jeff, I have 2 words for you. Ford Foundation.
Yes.
Cha-ching.
Yes.
That is your nirvana right there, my friend.
There you
They will take care of that and make that happen. So, all right, we got to bounce out of here. Jeff Vincent, thank you so much for spending time with us. We really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun, and man, I can't say this as many times or any more times than I have, man. You got to know this issue, especially, as a planner all across the country. I don't even care where you live, the value of an urban campus or a suburban or rural, right? But it's a major part of the planning landscape that I just don't think we talk enough about. So Jeff Vincent, thank you for joining the Planning Commission podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It's great.
All right. Have fun at the concert tonight. All right. For our listeners, head over to our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Remember, subscribe, like, and we appreciate you listening. To my fellow commissioners, can I have a motion to adjourn?
Oh, my turn. So moved.
All right. Thank you all. We'll see you next time. Appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Commissioner Danley here. Would you like to see more? Hear more? Well, we got you covered. Go to our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. It's got everything you want. Guests, yep, past episodes, video, the audio, even our whiskey pairing, links to everything about all the people we've had on, books, websites, you name it. It's unbelievable. You want to reach out to us? Please. We'd be more than happy to chat. You can email us, planningcommissionpodcast@gmail.com. You want to tweet at us? Go for it, @planningcommish. We're also on YouTube with the Planning Commission Podcast channel, Facebook. Heck, send us a carrier pigeon if you need to. We'd love to hear from you about ideas, guests, you name it. Thank you for listening. We appreciate it. We'll keep doing our thing. You keep doing yours. Have a good one.